This was a popular home unit. I mentioned previously about Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward. These were devices that people would use for treatment at home. This container here is the size of a 1.5 volt standard dry cell battery, very common at the time, and I believe that you can still purchase them. You would slip the battery down in here, and the screw contacts would be tightened onto these two connectors, and then you had this little switch which would put the current through the coil, and we've got another vibratory contact on the end of this coil, a mechanical interrupter, that would open and close and basically cause an oscillation through this coil, which had two windings in it. It had a primary winding and a high turns ratio of a secondary winding, which would produce very low voltage or very low current but high voltage electrical output, which could be varied by changing the inductance of the coil by moving this metal sleeve in and out of the magnet that sits inside this coil. This contact would be adjusted over here for getting the proper arcing. These were called Wagner's hammers. And then through a series of leads going through the contact plate, it would be brought out on these wires. Here we have a foot plate that you would step on, okay? And you would moisten this sponge, and you'd have a pad, and you would be able to apply a current through various parts of the body. Like if I wanted to do it to a foot, I'd stand on the foot plate down here and run current through my leg and provide myself a treatment. And you would be able to vary the intensity by moving this slug in and out. Basically, you cranked it up to the point that you could barely stand it. You were feeling these electrical impulses. There was a physical condition associated with it. And then the top of the unit here was instructions and basically storage. This unit was found in mint new condition in an old store that was being torn down. It was never sold. It sat on the shelf since whoever had purchased it for resale. And this dates back probably to the turn of the last century, maybe the late 1890s to about 1910, 1915, somewhere in that area. Tens and tens of thousands of these things were made throughout the world, not just in the United States. Use of electrical treatments like this for diseases was well established, well known, and was very effective. You can't sell the kinds of quantities of these devices if they're relegated now into the quack category, because they actually did work. Unfortunately, not 100% of the time. Incidentally, these attachment wires were referred to in the profession as rheophores. Now, this is some handheld electrodes that came along with that. This was a later version that used a pair of D-cell, dry cell flashlight batteries, which of course you can still buy. It was basically this all built up into this neat little wand container that had a variable intensity control on the side, and you would hook an electrode to it going through one of these holes that would have various pad devices, and you would provide yourself an electrical treatment by operating these rollers in various parts of the body. There's another pad that you would strap on. This was called an electreat, and many of these things were sold. Almost every week I find 3 or 4 of these for sale on eBay, so there were an awful lot of these made. This one was also in new condition. Okay. This particular device, very beautifully made, nice brass and so forth. This was produced in France, and I believe this particular unit dates back to about 1875. Okay. Here was a electromechanical timer, very nice brass encasing, a precision-made magnetic coil. The adjustments and so forth are internal, and you would take off this cover that had a lens assembly, and you would be able to go down in there and adjust the contact points, and then put the lens back in. There was a little storage place underneath here. It's a little difficult to get that where you put your accessories and so forth. And the batteries would fit in these holes up here and connect to these terminals. So this was another shock type device, a vibratory shock device. This was interesting. You would wet these wheels, moisten these wheels, and then roll the wheels across the body part that you wanted to treat. Again.
Is that a pulsed?
Yeah, it's pulsed because
low voltage pulse current.
Yeah, high voltage, but very low current.
All right, yeah.
Okay, because of the transformer action that you would get. You know, this was probably 3 volts, 2 1.5 volt batteries in series. There was not a lot.
You're not really feeling it.
Well, yeah, you're getting the tingle. Oh, it's not unpleasant. It's not going to knock you off your feet. Okay, although some of this technology is capable of doing that. Some of the earlier ones were actually hand cranks that had permanent magnets, like the old field artillery phone. They would, oh boy, they'd rock you. And see, those date back to the Civil War of 1865.
Yeah.
They've been around a long time. Okay? Now, as we improved on this, we moved up to, where is the other gizmo? Oh, here it is.
Up down there.
Yeah. Okay, now the English, not to be outdone, always believed in fine craftsmanship, and I got to hand it to them on this one. They did a beautiful job. This is what's called a chloride battery, and these were actual batteries that you would purchase, and they would fit into this rack. And by strapping in various contacts, you would add more and more of these batteries to the circuit. These batteries, when they became depleted, you would send them back to the factory. They would refurbish them and send you replacements. And that would just fit right down there in that slot. And then you would strap up the terminals and hook it up. This was a intensity control that was designed. And these boxes would produce the different types of treatments, both your galvanic and your ferratic voltages and so forth. And very nicely done. It also had the vibrator built into it over here where you could generate that arc.
Isn't there a third type of current?
Sinusoidal, galvanic, and ferratic as the basic 3. And of course, all of these were at voltage levels that you would be able to feel. It was a physiological effect. Now, I keep mentioning that because that's a relatively important concept that as we move into later stages of this technology, it becomes important. So that's why I'm emphasizing the fact that you do feel this. Okay? Okay. Now, basically, we believe that Rife's inspiration, what gave him the idea of taking his optical technology through the development of his microscope, was probably inspired by the work of a gentleman that was considered one of the greatest quacks of his time, the greatest quack of the century. His name was Albert Abrams, and he has developed a loyal following now of crackpots that are into a technology called radionics. And what this device was, this is one of his first units. This was an electromechanical diagnostic tool, a diagnostic machine, that would measure various voltage and current parameters in the body by inducing a signal into the body, and sort of like sonar, getting back a reflection. And what it was doing is it was using a series of different current ratios and frequencies and so forth that was operated by this mechanical tick-tock oscillator, which if you'll look in the old 1934 Crane video, John Crane shows this device actually operating in the background. Now, it's not necessarily this particular one. It probably isn't. But they then switched to an oscilloscope waveform where you can see the waveform that comes out as a result of this activity. Okay. Now, Dr. Abrams claimed that there is a specific energy that all organisms emanate, and even partial materials of that organism, just like a cell being capable of creating an entire body. If you take, for instance, a hologram and you break a glass pane that's a hologram, each individual piece contains the entire picture of the hologram. You can illuminate that and still see the image even out of all of the pieces. Okay, so what Abrams theorized is that you could send him mail him in a hair sample, a blood sample, a saliva sample, and he could find that resonant characteristic of that particular organism and determine the type of disease. Now, of course, this is total nonsense, total, insanity, until we reached about 2000 and 2005, where scientists are now beginning to rediscover that old Abrams was way ahead of his time. Okay, there are now some scientific devices that are being used that are getting positive results. Of course, the scientific community just continues to ignore this. But Abrams was onto something, and Rife obviously recognized that. And we have to realize that before Rife's microscope, these electrical type energy methods were being used on a very large-scale basis. They were not getting good results or continual results all the time. And the benefit, and probably what Rife will always be known for, is the microscope, the energy machines, the frequency machines, and so forth that were developed on his behalf with Lee DeForest and some of these other people that were involved, was basically taking a technology that was already known and was already being used and had been used for 75 years before Rife even started working with this. He just was able to use these machine electrical technologies, mechanical technologies, effectively once he had the microscope, because he could see the results that he was getting. So that was his major contribution, and that's probably what he's going to be remembered for. But this was called an oscilloclast. This was one of the first diagnostic combination treatment machines, and apparently he got some pretty good results using this. It's a whole field of esoteric type medicine, which is really on the fringe even today. But a lot of people are getting into this, and there's been an awful lot of information written about this technology. So there is something to it. I don't completely understand it, of course, and nobody really does, but it's certainly not something that I would poo-poo, even though he was called a quack. And you could obviously see that a guy's making those kind of claims with a contraption like this would be considered to be a little bit off. Of course, most brilliant people are. Okay, now we are getting into Rife's era. These were high voltage, high frequency, spark gap diathermy machines. They produced, they had Odin coil type resonators inside of them. There was a spark gap, an adjustable spark gap. Spark gaps were used quite a lot in those days. And this would be used for cauterizations. It had sinusoidal and faradic and all the other stuff in it. But it was known for this coil, a pancake coil down inside here, that was part of the Uden resonator that would produce extreme high voltages. Now these were used for power sources for evacuated vacuum tubes that were being used to take x-rays. And this would have been a power source for an x-ray machine, which of course is quite dangerous. But by taking a non-vacuum type tube with a rare earth gas in it, usually it was helium, the high voltage would ionize the gas, which would ionize everything around it, including the surrounding areas of the tissue where you made contact. And that caused a breakup of the moisture content of the water, which is H2O, water and hydrogen. And it would take the electrons of the oxygen molecule and break some of them off and actually produce ozone within the body fluids itself. And as you saw earlier in the gas chamber back there, ozone is a tremendously powerful germicide. So these devices, absolutely without question, did work, and probably very well, especially in the hands of a skilled practitioner. A cable would have come off of here. You would have had an insulated wand, a handheld wand, and then the treatments would be applied to the patient. And I have some documents here in some photographs that were taken out of some books that basically show these electrical treatments. We'll get to this in a minute. You'll look at the arrangement of the resonator and the Tesla coil in the patient. This basically was a portable unit that would be providing this type of technology, and again, very effective. Here is a handheld cage, an auto-condensation cage. Here is a diagram of what's called an auto-condensation couch, where the patient actually became part of a tuned electrical circuit, and high voltage, high frequency currents passed through the patient's body. And we are talking about voltage potentials ranging anywhere from 175,000 to about 225,000 volts at currents upwards of 1.5 amps. That is a huge amount of current. However, as I mentioned earlier when we showed the mechanical shock devices, those devices, those battery devices, provided a physiological response. The body's nervous system could detect it. The muscles would expand and contract and do all sorts of crazy things. They discovered that when the frequency, the alternating current frequency, was raised above 10,000 cycles, 10 kilohertz, there was no physiological effect. The patient felt nothing. So they could take these voltage potentials, and as long as there was enough insulation between the two sections of this capacitor, the base of the lounge chair had a metal screen of some sort underneath it. Then you had the insulating pad that the patient would then lie on, and then if you'll see on the hands here, there's electrode wires connected to the patient's hands, which went back across this coil. This would have been your Uden resonator coil, and these would have been the Leyden jars or the charging capacitors. And in many cases, you would have also found these arcs, these electric arcs. In fact, I've got a diagram of that right here that shows the spark gaps. Here you have a picture of what they called an auto-condensation couch. Here is a violet ray set, very similar to this unit back here. And we covered that. They also had cages. People would stand in metal cages, and they would get the electrostatic currents that would pass through their bodies. They got away from this because people had claustrophobia. That's one of the reasons why the new modern MRI machine, the open MRI machine, is more popular, because people don't get that claustrophobic experience of being contained inside something. Here was another version of a chair. These were glass insulators that kept the chair off of the floor so that you didn't have arc over. This was an electric corset that women would wear that would be charged up with this energy. And here we have a hand crank device that dates back to 1865, the Civil War era. There was a giant horseshoe magnet. It's very hard to see here. Giant bar, cast iron, or some type of an iron bar that was charged with magnetism, a permanent magnet. A series of gears connected to a hand crank, which had these coils that would rotate inside the field of this magnet and produce electrical currents that would come out on the handheld rheophores to the electrodes. Here we have other versions of this. Here's a chair with buckets that the patient would put their feet in. Here's a motor generator set that would do that type of stuff. There's a fairly good indication of a guy receiving a treatment sitting in a chair with one of these types of machines. And here is a very nice, this was called the Fisher diathermy machine. This is one of the most popular. It was just beautifully made, beautiful piece of equipment. Here we have an earlier violet ray set. I'm going to show you one of those in operation.